He tried to frame an innocent black worker, but met a lawyer who doesn't play by the rules. New York met the year 1957 with a cold that fused the steel of progress with the rust of neglect. The streets of Harlem that winter morning were gray and veiled in smoke from cheap coal burned in diners, laundromats, and dilapidated buildings where radiators groaned like old bones and frost-bitten windows trembled in the wind. People didn't wake to alarm clocks but to the daily uproar of city life. Bus horns, the clang of trash bins, and the arguments of neighbors separated by thin walls. Above the rooftops, laundry lines stretched like the taut strings of worn-out patience, where every day was a balancing act between survival and hope. Isaiah Washington, known on the streets as Ike, left his apartment earlier than usual. He lived above a corner grocery run by a Haitian couple who kept track of every cent and every look a white cop gave them. Ike had the kind of face no one forgot, deep lines between his brows, thick mustache, and eyes that carried fatigue, vigilance, and a fury disguised as professional calm. He didn't wear expensive suits, only threadbare corduroy jackets, always clean. His coat hung off his shoulders like a sergeant's overcoat who had survived more than one war, and that's exactly what it was. Ike had survived everything Harlem had to offer a black man with a voice and a mind. He moved through the street with sharp purpose. People standing by storefronts and newsstands recognized him. Some waved. Others just watched with silent hope. Because Ike wasn't just a lawyer. He was the last thread of belief, the final chance. Outside his office in an old building at the corner of 145th Street and Lenox Avenue, a line had already formed. Women with children, old men clutching worn folders, teenagers in secondhand coats. People who no longer believed in the police, the courts, or even God, believed in Ike, and he knew he had no right to fail them. Inside, the office smelled of cold coffee, damp paper, and the clove lotion Ike used in place of cologne. His secretary hadn't shown up, again. Trouble with rent, she'd said. He wasn't sure anymore whether he was helping her stay afloat or just giving her a reason not to vanish altogether. He hung up his coat on the bent hook, sat down at his desk, and rubbed his eyes. Outside, the peeling sign that read Washington and Associates caught the morning light as if there really were associates. There weren't. Just him, the files, and his voice in court. Across town, in a different New York, different in scent, light, and meaning, Daniel Thorne was waking up to the rustle of silk sheets. His penthouse on the Upper East Side looked more like a museum. Glass, marble, paintings imported from Europe by his grandfather, a banker who had moved his fortune before the crash. Daniel had always known the world belonged to men like him, with strong chins, perfect posture, and last names that sounded like verdicts. He drank his coffee not from a paper cup, but from fine porcelain, flipping through the morning paper. The name Isaiah Washington in the New York Post made him smirk. Another circus, he thought. Another self-proclaimed hero of the downtrodden, selling truth for cheap fees and cheaper glory. At the DA's office, they greeted him like a general. Polite, precise, calculated flattery. He passed clerks and attorneys without a glance. Everything that needed to happen would happen on his say-so. His office looked like a diplomat's lounge. Leather-bound books, the American flag, trophies. No room for doubt, only law, or what passed for it. That day, the law demanded blood. In a Brooklyn alley near a Union building, they found a body, white male, politician, middle tier, but well-connected. Bullet to the chest, wallet untouched, no sign of robbery. Beside the corpse, a black factory worker, dazed, blood-covered, silent. Mute, as it turned out. No testimony, no defense. Just race, place, and the boiling anger of the public already climbing the streets. Daniel viewed the case like a chess player spotting a quick mate. No motive needed, no clean evidence, just narrative. This murder had to be solved fast, judged loudly, and forgotten quickly. The city wanted answers. He was ready to deliver a swift conviction, a familiar scapegoat. On paper, it was perfect. But paper, as Daniel had yet to learn, can catch fire from a single glance. By noon, Ike had heard. In Harlem, news traveled faster than subways. A boy who washed butcher shop windows came running. They picked up the mute from Hunts Point. Ike's stomach twisted. He had other clients, other cases, but he knew this was it, the one that would either begin something or end everything. He left for the precinct without waiting to be called. If he didn't get there now, it would all be over before it even started. At the station, white officers exchanged glances. One of them, young and chewing gum, quipped, "Here to save another criminal?" Ike didn't answer. He just demanded the file and access to the suspect. No cooperation, just smirks, just delay, just the desk sergeant saying, "No public defender yet, and he won't talk no matter what you do." Ike smiled, tired, bitter. He didn't need him to talk. The silence had already spoken volumes. By evening, he sat in his office lit only by a desk lamp, flipping through documents he'd gotten through threats, favors, and backroom calls. The case was too neat, too clean, like someone had draped a sheet over a bloodstain. He remembered his own father's case years ago. A false charge, the same tidy paperwork, the same quiet malice. He stood, walked to the window. Evening Harlem buzzed, fought, survived. But Ike heard something else. The rhythm of a city ready to swallow one more black life without a trace. He felt history call on him again, not as a hero but as a witness. Across town, in a high-rise office overlooking the Hudson, Daniel signed off on paperwork. He didn't yet know that this case held no name, no street, no motive. Only a secret, one he wasn't ready to confront, where law, honor, and justice were not the same. This was how their road began. The courthouse on Spring Street, nestled among the rough brick buildings and marble facades of Manhattan, felt especially foreign that day. Like a bastion of the old order, its walls didn't just echo precedent, they preserved the very spirit of what the city called justice and what Harlem knew as a sentence. The wide columns out front, seemingly erected for display, greeted every visitor like carved stone warnings. "You're here, but you don't belong." Inside, it was no warmer. Courtroom 4, neither the largest nor the most ornate, but certainly the most public, was already packed by the time the hearing began. The room had no official divisions, but the lines were drawn all the same, visible in every glance. Up front sat the white journalists with their notepads staring through those seated behind them. Black men and women, many not there as witnesses or family, but simply as witnesses to history. Because any case that brought a black defendant into this courtroom wasn't just a legal matter, it was precedent, fuel for another excuse to justify what never should be. Ike entered later than he'd planned. His clerk had bungled the filing motions, and a white cop had stopped him outside the subway, demanding proper ID with a tone that implied his pockets might hold a gun or a needle, not legal credentials. The delay hadn't been an accident, it never was. But still, he walked in upright, carrying quiet fury like a loaded weapon. People recognized him, even those who didn't know his name. His presence alone with that worn black briefcase, frayed overcoat, and unflinching stare disrupted the ritual. The court didn't expect anything good from Isaiah Washington. Not the judge, gray-haired, brooding, with more verdicts in his memory than doubts. Not the jury, faces drawn tight, as if already bracing to explain to their neighbors why they were even involved in this case. He approached the defense table. The defendant, a young black man just past 20, mute, sat with hands in his lap and eyes too wide for a grown man. He didn't cry. He didn't beg. He just sat there, as if even the smallest movement might be held against him. Ike took his seat. He didn't greet the prosecutor. He didn't look his way, but he felt the stare, hard, searing. Daniel Thorne was already seated, immaculate in a gray suit, hair styled in a perfect wave, and with the kind of expression worn by men who consider themselves judges long before the gavel falls. He was angry, not because Ike had broken rules, but because Ike had entered a game Thorne hadn't invited him to. When the judge opened proceedings, the air thickened. Even the walls seemed to lean in. Thorne went first. His opening was flawless, cold, structured like a chess match. He didn't shout, didn't accuse directly. He simply built a context in which guilt was obvious. A black man found beside the body, mute, offered no resistance during arrest, previously employed at the same warehouse where the victim's business partner had interests. No alibi, no defense, no words. Just a shadowy figure, ready to be turned into a monster. Ike listened without interruption. He made notes. He watched the jury. He felt the breathing of the room, and he sensed it. In this silence, there was already more conviction than in Thorne's entire argument. When his turn came, Ike didn't rise right away. He pulled a single sheet of paper from his folder, one of the few documents he'd managed to pry out of the archives. Arrest records, timeline inconsistencies, a boot print that didn't match the defendant's shoe size, no fingerprints, no motive except proximity to the body. He didn't appeal to morality. He spoke the language of logic, the kind this courtroom too often ignored. And he knew even the perfect argument wouldn't matter if the jurors had already decided. But he spoke anyway, because silence would have made him complicit. Thorne listened. For the first time in a long while, he listened not to counter but to understand. Ike saw the shift in his face. Subtle, but there. The smile disappeared. His eyes narrowed. That clean, orderly world of clues and conclusions began to crack. Because Ike, the so-called streetwise loudmouth, was hitting where it hurt most. The foundation, the structure, the part that was never meant to bend. And then came the witness. Thorne had brought him in, a former warehouse guard. White, tall, gaunt, a face worn by smoke and sleepless nights. His testimony was neat, almost mechanical. He saw the defendant come around the corner, heard a noise, found the body. Seemed simple, too simple. Ike watched him and felt the chill. Something was off, not in the words but in the emptiness behind them. He began his cross, small, sharp questions that danced between procedure and common sense. The guard faltered, not overtly, not clumsily, but just enough to feel the truth slipping through the cracks of a script. When the session ended, the courtroom emptied reluctantly. People rose slowly, as if worried that even standing might be seen as taking a side. Ike gathered his papers. He didn't expect gratitude, but he noticed one thing. A woman, elderly, in a shawl, nodded once. No words, just a nod. That was enough. At the exit, he ran into Thorne. They didn't speak, but their eyes met. And in that collision was everything. Class, race, history. One gaze held defiance. The other, distrust, laced with something new. Unease. It was their first meeting outside the myths. And it was no longer just personal. Snow in New York didn't fall the same way for everyone. On the Upper East Side, it turned the streets into a postcard. Sparkling storefronts, snow-dusted steps of brownstone buildings. The scent of coffee was cinnamon wafting from cafe entrances, where white waiters served white customers with smiles rehearsed for magazines. But in Harlem, the snow squeaked underfoot, stuck to the soot and car exhaust, clung to windows covered in newspapers, and turned into icy grime that stayed in boots until nightfall. The city lived in two dimensions, divided not by streets, but by gazes, laws, and consequences. On Monday morning, 2 days after the court hearing, Daniel Thorne sat in his office, motionless like a statue, but inside something restless was already stirring. Around him the usual silence of power reigned, the books in leather bindings, the mahogany desk, the smooth bust of Hamilton on its pedestal like a symbol of the old order. He was reviewing the case documents, each time stumbling upon the same small imperfections he might have missed or chosen to ignore before. The official version, the one he had already presented in court, was straightforward, yet disturbingly easy to fit into public expectation. The defendant was black, mute, found at the crime scene. The motive was supposedly personal grievance. The evidence was circumstantial. The witness was a guard with fatigue in his eyes and a hint of alcohol in his voice. Everything seemed right, and yet with every new line, Daniel felt something slipping away. Like behind the smooth facade, another story was hiding, the one no one wanted to hear. He began to make calls, first to the archives, then to the police department. Some refused to provide copies of protocols. Others said they were lost. One clerk, nervously hesitating, mentioned that part of the documents had been transferred to another department. Another department? Where? Who gave the order? Why? Daniel started to realize the case that seemed like a convenient career ladder was beginning to smell rotten. That night, Ike was heading back to his office, the wind howling around him. In his hand, he held a folded sheet of paper taken from one of his sources, a former correspondent for a union newspaper, now a newspaper delivery man. The paper was a copy of a memo from the city inspector, addressed to an unknown official with a note. The matter is settled, witness paid, protocol destroyed. The dates matched. The name of the witness was the same guard. The sum, $500, $500 for silence or for a fabrication. Ike wasn't sure yet, but he felt it. He was digging deeper, and under every layer of dirt, there was another stickier one. He walked through Harlem again. From Mrs. Cole's laundromat to the abandoned building of the old Union headquarters, its walls still covered in faded slogans. Equal rights aren't a request, they're a demand. He spoke with drivers, janitors, former colleagues of the accused. Those who were too afraid to speak openly nodded, looked away. Some even closed the door in his face. Fear was in their voices, fear and apathy. Because here, the truth too often ended on the steps of the district court. Meanwhile, in Daniel's office, something unexpected was happening. He started writing by hand, without a secretary, without protocols. He began sketching a map, connections between the key players. A politician, murdered in Brooklyn, had previously overseen a city tender. A company tied to Upper East Side developers won the bid. That same politician was involved in a labor union merger dispute, where the defendant had been an activist. All of this could have been a coincidence. It would have been, if not for the strange disappearance of some of the records and one detail. The defendant, according to the neighbor, had said 2 days before the murder that someone was trying to make him stay silent. That evening, Daniel found an envelope in his mailbox without a stamp. The paper inside was cheap, grayish, with barely legible letters. Your father knew what process for the sake of order meant. Be careful. History likes to repeat itself. A chill ran down his spine. His father, Judge Thorne, who died of a heart attack in 1951, was considered a model of law and order. But Daniel knew he had been involved in exceptions when, for the sake of the greater good, cases were closed before the trial even started. He never asked questions, until now. Meanwhile, Ike sat in a late-night cafe where old men, chess players, poets, and homeless people gathered. He drank bitter coffee and made notes in his notebook. He knew the chain of crimes wasn't in knives and gunshots, but in papers and signatures. He was isolating the structure. Who, where, when, and most importantly, why. Every link led to familiar names: the deputy mayor, the police chief, a businessman from Jersey, a campaign sponsor. And at one point, while walking down Lenox Avenue, he felt it. Someone was watching him. Not openly, not directly. The same man, twice meeting his gaze. A car appearing at the corner just a little too timely. They weren't muggers, they were watchers. And Ike realized he had found the nerve. Daniel, too, felt the shift. At the entrance to the prosecutor's office, Two employees quickly fell silent as he approached. One of the reports left on the desk disappeared within 10 minutes. And all of this against the backdrop of smiles, social receptions, and invitations to the Club of Justice, where those who saw themselves as the elite of the law gathered. He started to be afraid, but not for himself, for what he had been drawn into, a system that crushed anyone who stared too long at its inner workings. Somewhere between the documents and the streets, their paths began to converge. They hadn't spoken yet, but they both knew they were moving toward one center, and behind that center was not just a murder, but a system that either had to be destroyed or become a part of. When Daniel Thorne walked into the West Side Club, an upscale jazz bar on the corner of 66th Street and Columbus Avenue, the confidence in his eyes was still there, but his gait now carried a weight that hadn't been there before. The bar, soaked in golden light and the scent of expensive tobacco, was quiet, almost intimate. At the tables sat white men in suits, all seemingly identical, with the glassy-eyed look of those who had long since stopped believing life held any surprises. The bartender, a dignified mulatto in his 50s, with a gray streak at his temples, nodded briefly at Daniel, his professionalism cold and distant, as he did with all the white patrons. He knew by now that true freedom was when you could blend into the background unnoticed. Ike was waiting at a corner table, offering a clear view of the entrance and the windows. He didn't trust places where the street wasn't visible, nor people whose hands stayed too long on their laps. He wore a gray tweed jacket, long out of fashion, with a sheen on the elbows from constant rubbing. In front of him was a glass of water. He didn't drink in places like this, not out of conviction, but out of habit. He knew that anything you drank among white men in ties could be used against you. Their meeting was silent. No handshakes, no smiles, just gazes. In them were two worlds, two biographies, two different Americas, finally colliding not on the pages of a case file, but in the real space between them. Daniel sat carefully, as one does when sitting across the negotiating table from an adversary who might turn out to be the last person to see you alive. "I have problems," he said, not loudly, not asking, just stating the facts. Ike remained silent. He had heard those words dozens of times, spoken by widows, by men beaten in alleyways, by mothers who'd lost sons to friendly fire from the police. But to hear them from someone who had served the system, it was a confession in itself. The walls weren't as strong as they had seemed. Daniel didn't elaborate. He only said the main things. Someone was watching him, documents were disappearing. Someone from inside the prosecutor's office was trying to control him. He didn't know who, but he felt it. The case was bigger than a murder. Much bigger, and he couldn't continue alone. Not because he wasn't capable, but because even the offices where coffee was once served without question now regarded him with suspicion. Ike understood. He saw that before him wasn't a hero, an ally, or a remorseful privileged man. It was a person who, for the first time in a long while, had been pushed outside his world. He was standing on the edge, and now he had to learn to breathe the air that had once only belonged to them. Ike agreed, without enthusiasm, without words of reassurance, but with a cold understanding. One person couldn't handle this case alone, and Daniel, for all his faults, had something Ike lacked. Keys. Keys to doors, to archives, to people who couldn't even be reached in Harlem, not even for money. Their collaboration began in the lobby of an old printing building on 125th Street, once home to an Afro-American Union newspaper. Now it was a semi-ruined space with the scent of dust and wet concrete, but Ike knew it was a place where they could talk without worrying about bugs. He brought Daniel here to show him. The struggle didn't start in the courtrooms, it began in the ruins. They sat at an old desk, a lamp hanging by a wire like a broken heart. Ike laid out photographs before Daniel, grainy, blurry, like the truth itself. Faces, people from evening events, some in the company of businessmen, others at the funeral of the politician who'd been murdered over the case. Connections formed like a web: police, developers, lawyers, the committee for distributing federal funds. At the center, a figure who couldn't yet be named. But Daniel recognized one person in the photo. It was the assistant district attorney, his colleague, the person who, on the day of the murder, had insisted on the urgent arrest, the person now avoiding Daniel. Days stretched on. They drove around the city. Ike showed Daniel streets he'd never walked, alleys where the police only appeared to arrest, diners where a white man caused the same suspicion as a black man in a business suit in a business district. They spoke with factory workers, women from church, taxi drivers who dropped off important guests at addresses with no signs. And the more Daniel listened, the more he realized how much he hadn't known. Not because he couldn't have known, but because he had never thought it necessary. He saw how the police, when they appeared with Ike, didn't look at him, but at him through Ike, as though Ike was spoiling the image. He heard whispers in diners. "What's he doing here?" And for the first time, he understood what it meant to be an outsider. Meanwhile, Ike observed Daniel. He saw how his arrogance disappeared, how he began to adjust his tie less, speak less, think more. Ike knew this didn't mean Daniel had changed. It meant a crack had appeared, and cracks always let in doubt, which meant truth. One night, as they were returning from the Bronx, where they had met with the former guard who had been offered hush money, they noticed a car following them. Ike swerved suddenly, cutting through a narrow alley, and there they were, almost pressed against the wall. The driver in a gray coat was looking their way. He didn't shoot, he just stood there. It was a sign, a reminder. Later in Ike's office, Daniel's trembling fingers tried to light a cigarette, and Ike silently watched him. Then he stepped forward and lit a match. A silence hung between them. And in that silence was more than in any speech. This was how their alliance began, not voluntary, not based on trust, but on something deeper, the understanding that truth was worth more than status, and that if it wasn't brought to light now, no one would ever be able to. With each passing day, their investigation deepened like a wound into which salt was poured. The traces led not from the defendant's bench to the streets, but to marble-floored offices, places where decisions were made in whispers, behind polished wood doors locked with family names. The conspiracy, which had started as Ike's hypothesis, began to take on flesh. But with that flesh came fear, the kind that made the streets of Harlem hide in the evening fog, in the elevators in the prosecutor's office stop at the wrong floors. They now worked almost without pause. Ike's office, once a solitary trench among a mountain of files, had turned into the headquarters of a resistance. Everywhere, copies of archives, photographs, notes, and on the walls, strings connecting names, dates, places. Names resurfaced like long-sunken ships. The judge who signed the expropriation order for land to be developed. The police captain who led the raid on an illegal rally. The financier who donated to the murdered politician's campaign. They all seemed to exist in different planes, but now they converged in one point, and that point was located at the intersection of truth and silence. Ike knew every network pulls toward the heart, and in order to expose it, you had to open not just the system, but yourself. He had avoided this for years, keeping his past like a sealed archive. In it was pain he didn't want to repeat, even in thought. But one night, when only he and Daniel remained in the office, among mugs with cold coffee and an ashtray filled with strangers' cigarettes, he opened the drawer and pulled out a folder. Inside were old clippings, yellowed but carefully folded. There he was, 16 on the steps of the county courthouse, with eyes that still held faith. There was his father, led away in handcuffs, accused of raping a white woman, a case that fell apart a year later, when his father had already died in prison. There was his mother, her face twisted in a scream, remembered by the reporter, but not by the court. This was his beginning, not as a lawyer, but as a fighter. And showing this to Daniel, he wasn't seeking sympathy. He was testing. How far was Daniel willing to go if the truth turned out not to be beautiful, but ugly? Daniel was silent for a long time. He hadn't expected this. He knew about the accusations against the system. He had read the articles, knew the statistics. But in this moment, he saw how easily someone else's tragedy could turn into a statistic on a report. He realized everything he had believed, laws, traditions, structures, could be used to destroy. He thought about his own father, the judge, whom he had always considered an example. But now digging through the cases, Ike had found connections. His father had handled several cases where black men were accused without lawyers, based on testimony from white witnesses who later disappeared from the city. One such case coincided with the very arrest of Ike's father. Thorne's name appeared in the conclusion, not as a prosecutor, but as a silent one. It was a blow. Daniel didn't defend himself. He closed the folder and simply said, "I didn't know." And in those words, there was no excuse. There was only acknowledgement. That same evening, someone threw a brick through Ike's office window. The shards of glass scattered across the floor like fragments of trust. The brick had a note. "Stop. We see everything." They now knew they had no time. Every step brought them closer, not only to the truth, but to those who were willing to do anything to keep it buried. The next day, they went to the east side, to the private archive of the city association, a place that usually required approval from above. Ike pretended to be an assistant prosecutor, and Daniel used his name. And for the first time, that name worked for them, not against. In the archive, they found documents that proved the secret transfer of land linked to an industrial zone through front companies. One of the deals was signed by a man named Richardson, the murdered politician's cousin. The land was supposedly for a social housing project. In reality, they planned to build private condominiums. One of the investors was a banker from the Harvard Club's Board of Trustees. The money flowed through a Veterans Aid Fund. It was all connected, and it was all criminal. On the way back, they noticed a car tailing them. They turned onto 110th Street, where an old bridge over the railroad led to the industrial sector. There, a car was waiting. Two men got out, one with a pipe, the other with a knife. These weren't thieves. This was a warning. A brief, sharp scuffle ensued. Ike struck first. Daniel didn't retreat. They fought them off. The car drove away. But now everything was painfully clear. They were being hunted. After that, everything changed. They no longer worked at night in the office. They moved to an old laundromat where Ike had kept his archives. It was damp, smelled of mildew, but it was safe. Trust between them was no longer in words. It was forged in actions. Daniel began speaking the language of the streets. Ike of systems. They, like two severed fingers, learned to be hands. One morning, Daniel brought in a clipping from an old newspaper, a photo from a charity ball showing his father, Judge Thorne, next to the same businessmen who were now in the case. He looked at Ike and said, "I thought I knew where I came from, but I guess I was wrong." Ike nodded. "Welcome to the club." And so the most important thing began to happen. Without realizing it, they became not just allies, but people who now knew. The past wasn't just a backdrop, it was fuel. And unless you acknowledge where you come from, you can't get where you need to go. Everything was narrowing. Space, time, the circle of trust. New York, the city of a million windows, now seemed like an endless gray cage where every alley, every glance, every movement could be the last. Ike and Daniel no longer divided the city into districts. They now divided it into safe and deadly zones. They knew those behind the conspiracy had stopped playing. Now the stakes were real, just like the price of failure. The last week had passed in flight, unofficially, because neither of them had access to any resources anymore. Officially, they were still in their positions, prosecutor and defense lawyer, opposite figures on a board that no one controlled anymore. In reality, they had turned into hunted prey, whose quarry was the truth, and their pursuers were people who knew no mercy. Ike, stubborn, with an ever-watchful gaze, now looked tired. Dark circles had settled beneath his eyes, and his movements had become sharper. He barely slept, ate in snatches, day after day, sorting through records as if looking for not evidence, but a way to understand where exactly the system had cracked, through which the lie had flowed. Daniel, neat, always impeccably shaved, had become a man who had lost the backbone of his faith. For the first time, he spoke not as a representative of the law, but as a man whom that very law had betrayed. At night, in the old basement of the print shop, where they had set up their last makeshift headquarters, they gathered everything. Ike pulled out a key document, a correspondence between three people: the assistant prosecutor, a businessman from the construction consortium, and the judge who signed the arrest of a young black worker. It spoke of compensation, profit, a quick closure of the case. Not a single direct admission, only hints, the language of power, careful but deathly clear for those who knew how to read between the lines. Their plan was madly risky. Ike insisted, "They won't let us into official channels. We'll only become news when we become bodies. The only way is to strike in front of everyone." Daniel nodded. He knew what Ike meant. If the truth didn't become public, it would drown. And if they died with it, no one would remember their names. It was decided. They would speak at a public forum in front of City Hall as part of the annual briefing on the state of municipal justice. The press had been invited in advance. Officials, lawmakers, journalists, and federal observers would be present. It was a place where you either died or won. On the day of the speech, New York was cold and cruel. The sun peeked through the tall buildings as if afraid to witness what was coming. A dense circle of reporters had gathered near City Hall. Police stood on the perimeter. Cameras were aimed at the podium where the district prosecutor was supposed to speak. He did not appear. Instead, Ike Washington stepped up to the microphone. In his worn coat, without identification, without invitation, without summons. His face was unknown to those who were accustomed to reports about golf or stock market fluctuations, but it was known to those standing at the back, the janitors, the technicians, the ordinary passers-by. He spoke calmly, not loudly, but each word fell like a blow. He told the story, not just of the murder, but of the system that had made it possible. He showed copies of letters, named names. His voice trembled, not from fear, but from tension. And in that moment, Daniel stepped up to the microphone beside him. In that moment, everything was laid bare. The white prosecutor from a family of judges, standing next to the black lawyer, considered the enemy of the system. They stood side by side, not in the courtroom, not behind closed doors, but in front of the city. Daniel spoke briefly. He confirmed that the documents were genuine. He announced that the case would be reopened. He publicly opposed his superiors, his system, his own name. And in this, there was no grandstanding, only the weariness of a man who had finally begun speaking the truth. The reaction was immediate. The police moved in. Someone ordered the sound to be cut off. Journalists rushed to their cameras. One of the officers pulled out his weapon, by protocol, but he stopped when he saw that the cameras were still rolling. An hour later, a scandal broke out in the city. Footage of the speech made it to the screens. The next morning's newspapers had headlines New York hadn't seen since the anti-lynching protests. Prosecutor breaks his silence. Conspiracy in the courts. Ike Washington, voice of the unheard. That evening, one of the figures in the case, a retired judge, was found dead in his home. Officially, it was heart failure. But Ike knew now they would not just be harassed. They would be erased. They survived, a miracle. Only because the information had gone beyond the city, federal agencies got involved. The case was transferred to the district court. The suspect, a mute young man, was released 2 days later. His mother hugged Ike without saying a word, but squeezing his hands so tightly that tears almost welled up in his eyes. Ike and Daniel sat on the courthouse steps. They were covered in dust, blood, someone else's broken truth. There was no victory in their eyes, only silence and respect. The kind that comes not from agreements, but from shared survival. They knew they would go on living, but no longer the same. Each of them now carried something of the other. And it was not weakness. It was the first step toward true justice. Ike returned to Harlem. His office had been ransacked, but the door still stood. He began again. The line outside was back. But now it wasn't just black people who came. A blond boy, about 10, stood in the hallway with his mother. She said, "We heard you fight for those who have no voice." And Ike nodded. He understood. His voice was now heard. And in his penthouse, where the air had once smelled of success, Daniel took down his father's portrait. And he never hung another. Truth doesn't shout. It quietly stays, like footprints, like a mother's sigh of relief. Ike and Daniel weren't heroes. They were brave enough to stand up when most would turn away. Justice isn't always loud. Sometimes it's a simple act of courage. If this touched your heart, you're not alone. For more stories that speak to the soul, subscribe and stay with us. Because the world needs to hear these truths.